So I will be talking about video games, to be more specific. But I think a good way to jump into this talk is actually focus on my subtitle instead of my title. We will get to the title later, but for now I will first talk about what I mean when I say that we can uncover fictional truths through unauthorized use. Of course, again, in video games. The best way to explain why I chose this subtitle and what it means is to give an example, I think. So I'm gonna immediately start by talking about one of my favorite games, Sekiro by From Software. It's important to note already that Sekiro, and actually every game that From Software ever designed, is very ambiguous in its story. It gives you hints, but you basically have to interpret and reconstruct the story yourself. So what I'm about to show here is one of the possible endings of the game Sekiro. In this ending, you see the old guy there, which is like the surrogate father of your avatar, the player character that is standing here. And, well, there's something special about this last scene of the game. So you can see him approach the camera, and then he does something very mysterious. He leans down, and he puts something next to the game camera. It makes a squishy noise when he puts it down, but that's the only thing that you can ever tell. You can never truly know what is put there. Literally, this is the only scene in which that object is even implied, right? So, once again, he puts it there, but what is it? Nobody knew until some YouTubers actually decided to investigate this. So, just so you know, I'm not only interested in games, but I also watch a lot of YouTube videos about games. And among them, among the YouTubers that I watch are Zully the Witch and Lance McDonald. I mention them both here because both of them discovered what the object was. Namely, by breaking the camera in this game's cutscene. What they did was they modified the game. They used a so-called mod to look at this cutscene from whatever perspective they wanted. So they made it so that they could move the game camera, although this is supposed to be a non-interactive cutscene, right? So this is Zully the Witch's rendition of that cutscene once again, while they are moving the camera around. So now we can already see that there is actually a virtual model in the hand of the character. I know this is very dark, by the way. I'm going to do some CSI magic soon. So Zully here focuses or tries to focus the camera on the object. And what do we see? The object that has been placed on the floor is a head. It's the head of another character in the game. And actually, it's quite easily recognizable who this is if you play the game. Namely, it is Genichiro, one of the game's enemies. And the grandson of the person that you just killed to finish the game. The corpse of that person is also still on this floor. So what you see here is an incredibly gruesome scene. Players might have guessed that in this ending of Sekiro, Genichiro, the one that you see here, was killed. But they could never have guessed, without breaking the camera, that Genichiro was beheaded, that our surrogate father took his head, took it to the top of a building to place it next to the corpse of his grandfather. And actually, for people trying to understand the story, this is pretty crucial information. That there's not just an implied unknown object there, but that it's the head of one of the main characters. So what I suggest is that what both Lance McDonald and Zully the Witch did here was find out for us, through using the game in an unauthorized way, that Genichiro was indeed beheaded and that his head was placed next to his grandfather's corpse. So I do think that this is a fictional truth within the game's story. We can discuss this later if you disagree, of course, but I will be taking this as a fictional truth throughout this presentation. Importantly, like I said, Zully the Witch and Lance McDonald aren't actually engaging with the work of fiction, this video game, as intended. They broke the game. They modified the source code to be able to move the camera in a cutscene that was supposed to be non-interactive. They weren't actually playing the game when they were doing this, but they were playing with it, as they say in game studies, right? I take this from Newman. They took advantage of the video game as a machine, as a piece of software that was very malleable and modifiable. Nevertheless, through this unauthorized use, I think they discovered this fictional truth. And that's, of course, the explanation of my subtitle. So, to further explain this, my plan for the rest of this presentation is to look a bit more specifically at what has already been said within philosophy of fiction about fictional truth in interactive fiction. And then I want to look at, and that's where my title comes in, the approach of genetic criticism in literature studies, because I think it's especially relevant for what I'm trying to present here. So I'm going to first say what genetic criticism is in literary analysis, or how it has been approached there. And then, of course, I'm going to try to see how it can be applied to games and why it is especially useful to apply it to digital and interactive works of fiction. I'm going to be presenting the game as a kind of fluid text. And then, because I'm, like I said, I'm such a fan of those YouTubers who are already doing this kind of research, I will discuss specifically how folk genetic game criticism is already being done by these YouTubers. So I will give you some more YouTube case studies at the end. But first off, truth in interactive fiction. I'm actually heavily leaning on the work of Alex Fisher, where is he? Sitting here in the audience, to explain how truth in interactive fiction has already been analyzed. Alex says that audience choice gives interactive fiction a branching structure, like that of a probability tree, where at each choice the narrative branches in different directions. I think in video games that is pretty clearly the case. Take, for example, Pokemon Blue or Pokemon Red, one of the first games that I played. At the start of the game, Professor Oak, one of the characters, asks you, are you a boy or are you a girl? And that is immediately the first choice that you can make in the game, which of course determines the gender of the main character. So already we have two branches here. And then the next choice in the game is, of course, picking your first starter Pokemon. You can pick between Bulbasaur, Squirtle, or Charmander, and the game basically makes you choose and choose and choose, and that's how you shape the narrative that belongs to your particular playthrough. And that's when Alex's distinction between branch truths and work truths comes in. It is branch true in a game that P, if and only if P is true in some but not all branches of the work. It is work true that P, if and only if P is true in all branches of the work. So a branch truth in my playthrough of Pokemon was, for example, that the player character was a girl and had a Charmander. This is not true for everyone who plays Pokemon, but it was true in my playing of it. A work truth in Pokemon, in that particular game, would be that there is a professor called Oak who gives you a Pokemon and does not simply assume people's gender. He asks every player ever who plays this game whether they are a boy or a girl. Now, interestingly, Rissa Willis, in another paper, has a very similar approach, but a bit different than Alex's, to branch truths and work truths in interactive fiction. They say that something is branch true in the fiction of a video game when it is present in at least one possible playthrough of the game, but contradicted by at least one other possible playthrough. In effect, that's going to be the same kind of thing as Alex was talking about. The most interesting difference, I think, is in the way that they describe work truths. Something is work true in a video game if it is present in at least one possible playthrough and never contradicted in any other possible playthrough. And this is what I want to focus on now, because this actually implies something very interesting that I want to work with. What this implies is the existence of so-called cross-branch truths in video games. What do I mean with this? These are fictional truths that are not supported by any representation in a current branch or in a current playthrough of a game, but that are still true in this particular branch or playthrough of the game by grace of one or more other branches of the game, making it clear that they are true in every branch. To make this a bit less vague, again, I can use an example that Willis already gave in their text. So they describe a game in which there is a character, let's call them X for now, but you only meet that character in specific branches of the game. So you have to make particular choices in the game to even be able to meet that character. So in a lot of branches, you wouldn't even meet them. You don't know anything about them. You don't learn anything about them. In another branch, this character dies very early, so you do get to know them, but you don't really learn anything about their backstory because they die early. There's only one branch in the entire game, so only one possible path that you can take in which you find out more about this character X, and actually then, in that playthrough, you can find out that X has a sister. Now this is interesting because Willis says, well, because it is true in that one branch, we can probably extrapolate this truth to every other branch. Even though we couldn't find it out in those branches, it is probably still fictionally true that X has a sister, even if we don't meet X, right? So these are the kinds of cross-branch truths that I am talking about. Now, to make matters even worse, I want to introduce another kind of cross-branch truth that I call artifact truths. And we've already seen one just now in the example, right? So I call artifact truths cross-branch truths that are derived from unauthorized branches. So my example, to give it here again in a more schematic form, take Sekiro's bad ending, right? There was actually no branching in that bad ending. The only thing that we could see in that ending, and we cannot even interact with it, is that an unknown object is placed on the floor, and we never find out what that object is. What I'm suggesting is that what Julie the Witch and Lance McDonald did was create a branch themselves, an unauthorized branch, through breaking the camera in that cutscene. So what they did is they basically added a branch to the game that wasn't supposed to be there, and by doing that, they found out that, in fact, in that unauthorized branch, it becomes clearly fictionally true that Genichiro is beheaded. Now, the interesting thing is, I think that it's very clear from the unauthorized branch that they created that we can take this to be true in the actual authorized version of the story as well. I think that they actually figured out what is the unknown object that is placed next to the camera in the authorized version of the game, namely Genichiro's head. So what I want to say is that these kinds of artifact truths are true in the authorized work because one or more unauthorized branches make it clear that it is true in the game world. And this, well, cross-branch truth is not contradicted by any authorized branch of the game. And this is something that we clearly see here. The authorized version of the video game ending that we can see in the unmodified ending of the game clearly is compatible with what they figured out. In fact, what they figured out helps us interpret the ambiguity or the incompleteness of the authorized game. So it's definitely not contradicted. I would very much like to say that I came up with this all by myself, but like I said, there has been an approach to literary analysis that is called genetic criticism, which actually starts from very similar ideas. So it is an approach to the study of literature which, in addition to and sometimes even in place of the final published text, takes sketches, notes, drafts, letters, and other preparatory documents as its object of analysis. The genetic critic is concerned with all of the material which precedes a work and which can form a single textual system with that work. I got to know genetic criticism because at the University of Antwerp there is, I don't know if you heard about this, the digital manuscript project for the works of Samuel Beckett. They actually digitized all of the manuscripts of Samuel Beckett, which you can also just find on their website. And it's very, very lovely to look at because Beckett was very prone to doodling a lot while kind of drafting his stories. So you can often find sketches, but also a lot of crossed out text that he didn't use, or at least didn't use in that version. So this is, of course, genetic criticism already at work. We're seeing what the process is behind the published text. What I'm especially interested in, for my purposes, is what has been called narratological genetics. So that is basically an investigation of the creative process behind the work to use it to gain understanding of the narrative presented in the work. So also basically to find out what is fictionally true in the published work. And an example of that is the crossed out text that I just mentioned, right? Very often we can find out, or we can fill in details of Samuel Beckett's work based on looking at deleted scenes from his manuscripts, right? So these deleted scenes might shed light on ambiguities or gaps in the final published story. And in Beckett's work, there are a lot of those. In fact, one of the genetic critics in Antwerp, Dirk van Hulle, said that Beckett's manuscripts are characterized by moving towards a greater ambiguity. So in fact, the most ambiguous and incomplete version of these texts are the finally published ones. And in the manuscripts, you find a lot more details, a lot more ideas that either weren't used or are just implied in the final work. So what does this have to do with video games? Well, I think this is a great approach to apply to video games. The first reason is that I think it makes a lot of sense because video games are digital. They have a source code, already a lot to work with, and they are interactive. So there are already a lot of branches to work with anyway. I will later elaborate on this a bit more. Another thing that I will elaborate on, using my beloved YouTubers, is that many gaming fan communities are already doing genetic game criticism, of kind of folk version, as I said before. So what makes digital or interactive works of fiction especially suitable for this kind of genetic approach? Well, I think that in many ways, the creative process of a game or the design process of a game is somehow included in the game itself when you buy it. For example, translations. Samuel Beckett wrote a lot of his works in French and English, but if you buy one of his works, most of the times you only get one of those versions of the work. Whenever you buy a video game like Sekiro, you get a lot of options. You can put them in Dutch, even in English, in Japanese. That was their original design language. So those languages already come with the work. You can already basically compare all the different versions of the stories in different languages by just having the copy of the game and changing the language in the menu. Secondly, there's, of course, this practice of frequently patching games. When you buy a game, very often it's updated still after you bought it, so the game constantly changes version. And you can also very often return to an earlier version of the game by deinstalling the patch, which is also obviously traces of the design process that you can look at. And then Bailey mentions that a lot of games contain so-called fossils. It's basically traces of earlier versions of the game that you can still find within the source code or even in the game itself, like the rendering of the game itself. So these are traces of alpha versions, first versions of the game, or cut content that is just still present somewhere in the source code. And this is something that I want to elaborate on as well, because there's this very interesting example of the so-called hot coffee minigame in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which actually caused a lot of genetic debate, even among game journalists. So what happened, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas got a certain age rating, which was quite high already because there's a lot of violence in that game. But at one point, they started debating whether the age rating should not have been higher, because in the source code of this game, people found this minigame in which there is a quite explicit sex scene where you actually have to push a button to have sex with the girlfriend of the character here. The interesting thing is that this minigame was not at all accessible in the actual version that people bought, but it was still somewhere in the source code. It was deleted at a late stage of the design process, but of course people found out about it, modded the game so that everybody could access and play this minigame again. So that's when debate started that actually the Grand Theft Auto San Andreas age rating should be much higher because of this explicit sex scene. And then a spokesperson of Rockstar, the publisher of Grand Theft Auto, said, well, that's not very fair, is it? Because compare it to an artist who makes a painting, and then he doesn't like the first version, and so he paints over the canvas with a new painting, right? That's what happened here. Hackers on the internet made a program that scratches the canvas to reveal an earlier draft of this game. But you should not interpret the game based on its earlier draft. Debatable, because Bailey actually objects, well, the painting metaphor is flawed because what we are dealing with here is a digital work. That means that if you buy a copy of a painting, then what you get is just a copy of the canvas as you see it. But if you buy, everybody who bought a copy of Grand Theft Auto has the minigame in the source code, because basically what you are buying is that source code. We can debate about this argument as well, but what I find interesting is what Bailey is suggesting here. Namely, that every copy of a game includes traces of the creation process of that game. Alpha version fossils, cut content, unpatched versions of the game, and translations. And I think those elements make games an especially good medium to apply genetic critical approaches to. So, also, like I said, many fan communities already figured this out and have been doing a kind of folk genetic game criticism. You find a kind of YouTube genetic game critics and Reddit game manuscript researchers. And that's what I want to talk about now, because I really think that academics can take a cue from game fan communities in this regard. So I'm just going to give a few examples where I think that these folk genetic game critics were especially successful. And one example is the mystery of Ocelot in Dark Souls 3. So what you see here is a boss in Dark Souls 3. He's called Osiris. And when you enter his boss fight arena, it becomes immediately clear that he's kind of a mad person because he constantly keeps talking to his son that seemingly he's holding in his hand, but obviously there's nothing in his hand. So this all actually kind of fits the story of the game. It's very weird, but I mean, lore-wise, Osiris is also called the consumed king because at one point he turned mad and he turned into a dragon. He was once human, apparently, according to the history within the game. So the kind of common interpretation of this part of the game was that, okay, this guy is bonkers crazy. He thinks he has a child. He thinks he's holding the child, but actually there's nothing there. This was also mentioned as such on the fan wikis about this game. Until my beloved Lance McDonald, once again, started digging into the game's code, right? And what he figured out is that in the alpha version of the game, there is a baby model, a virtual model of a baby, quite detailed even, in the hand of Osiris. And as soon as Lance published his findings about this alpha version of the game, people started updating their interpretation of Osiris. They said like, maybe what happened here is that at a late stage of production, they censored the baby. Good thing that they did, by the way, because at one point Osiris smashes his hand into the floor, and then the model was also updated to show a very bloody baby. It's horrible. So I see why they censored it, but it also updates what the story is about, right? Because now no longer is Osiris just this mad, delusional guy who thinks that he has a son, but he actually does have a son. It's just that we aren't shown that son because of reasons of censorship and age rating in video games. So this is already one example of how people updated their interpretations of the canonical story of a game based on information that we weren't intended to have necessarily. Another very interesting example, I think, is also Lance McDonald's investigations of one of the areas of Dark Souls 3 called Archdragon Peak. This area in the game has fictionally been destroyed by dragons. So it's very ruinous. You don't see a lot of details of what once was there. It's just a kind of implication that it was a very big city. But once again, when Lance McDonald looked at the earlier versions of this area within the game, it looked like this. So apparently, what the game designers did was they first built a city. They kind of had the layout of the city ready, and then they started making it more ruinous. So they started breaking down their buildings or the virtual models of their buildings to get to the final version. And Lance McDonald kind of suggests that, well, this is interesting, because by looking at an earlier version of the game in the design process, we actually find out more about an earlier version of the fictional area, about the fictional history of the area that we eventually play in. Because this is probably kind of what this area looked like before it was destroyed by dragons within the fictional game world. So what Lance McDonald is suggesting that he is doing here is a kind of game archaeology, right? Getting more insight into the game world's history through insight in the world's design processes history. One last example I want to go into is the process of fan communities kind of deciphering translation mistakes in video games. And again, I return to Sekiro. Like I said, this game was designed by a Japanese team and later translated to English. You can guess some weird stuff happened there in the translation. In Sekiro, you play as a kind of shinobi who has to protect this child, Kuro. And at one point in the game, Kuro is threatened by a Lady Butterfly. And so our character pops up to defend Kuro, who he has been defending for years at this point already, because he was assigned to Kuro when he was still a baby. So it's a very epic scene. Our character shows up to defend Kuro, and Kuro says, "Who are you?" This baffled me. Like, I thought maybe I misunderstood the story of the game, because these people literally have known each other for years at this point. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, okay, I thought maybe it's just one of those weird From Software things, maybe he lost his memory for some reason, but in fact, the explanation for this is much, much easier. Somebody tweeted about it. Activision actually messed up the translation of Sekiro. In fact, in the English version, Kuro says, "Who are you?" But in the Japanese, in the original version, he just says, "But what about you?" This makes so much sense. Kuro is actually worried about his Shinobi, who has been with him for years, and he's asking, well, if I run away and you're going to fight, what is going to happen to you? So again, we see here that, in fact, our story interpretation becomes much more easy and much more logical when we just look at other languages in this case. And this happens all the time in Sekiro, by the way. What you see here is another mini-boss in Sekiro. Sorry, all of them look pretty horrible. And as soon as you start fighting this guy, whatever, his name pops up on the screen, right, with the health bar. And his name is Long Arm Centipede Giraffe. Again, people started thinking oh, is there maybe a centipede clan and a giraffe clan in the game, and maybe he's whatever. In fact, once again, it's just stupid translation. He was supposed to be called Long Arm Centipede Girafu, which is an old Japanese name. It was never meant to be translated to English at all. They just thought they had to translate it for some reason. So again, this was just supposed to be his name and not refer to the animal giraffe. And based on these kinds of translation mistakes in Sekiro, I found this Reddit user who said, well, I decided to look for all the mistranslations during my next playthrough of Sekiro, and here is the result. And I was so pleasantly surprised by this result, because he actually linked to this big Excel sheet where he was doing basically genetic game criticism. He was comparing all of the English translations with the original Japanese, then translating the Japanese himself. I've been told that not all of his translations are good either, but fine. The approach was there. And yeah, he was trying to figure out, okay, how can we update our interpretation of the story in this game based on these original planned dialogues between the characters. So this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? This is genetic game criticism in action, and this is what I want to see more of, but maybe in academic circles instead. So to conclude, I think that, my conclusion for now is not very ambitious, I think. I'm just saying that fictional truths can sometimes be found outside of what is normally regarded as the work of fiction. If you want to know more about the authorized or the intended gameplay and story within video games, I think there's a lot of unauthorized branches that we can create to do that. Maybe by looking at translations, at the source code, at earlier versions of the game, or maybe even breaking the game, like breaking the game's camera, going out of the boundaries of the game. I think we can use a lot of these unauthorized branches to actually learn more about what is supposed to be there or what is actually fictionally true within the game. Of course, one question that I haven't really solved yet for now is what makes the things discovered within unauthorized branches canonically part of the fiction? For now, I've only mentioned one condition, which is probably too broad still, namely, it has to be discovered in this unauthorized branch and never contradicted within any of the authorized branches. But I think we need more conditions there, so any input there is helpful. But yeah, for now, I want to conclude. Let's take a cue from folk genetic game criticism on YouTube and Reddit. Thank you.